As I said before, I'm the new executive director for Our Children Our Way. I'm from the Seke Dene Nation. I am Saso-Chan. I sit with the Black Bear when I'm in Carrier and Second territories. I do want to acknowledge the traditional lands on which I am joining you from, and I'm calling in from the Lheidli T'enneh territory, known as Prince George. And I just wanted to actually stop for a moment and send our thoughts and prayers to the Filipino community in Vancouver, and send our thoughts and prayers for the tragedy that occurred over the weekend. Makes us stop and think that when tragedy strikes, our communities come together in any way we can, whether that be through thoughts, prayers, actions. So I just want to acknowledge that. Judy, if we could get you to open us up in a good way, that would be wonderful. Judy is one of our knowledge holders and advisor to the Our Children Our Way Society, and of course our matriarch that provides a foundation grounding for us. So if I could hand it over to Judy.
Okay, thank you, Joni. And I just seen Bart's message. Regional Chief is in the old chat or the old webinar link. So if someone can get Bart and Regional Chief the new webinar link, they were actually in the old webinar link. That happened to Kai this morning too. Anyway, I just noticed that message. And I'll do the opening prayer. Cook Jam Call, Cook Be Creator, Great Spirit, we thank you for today. And we thank you for everyone joining us across the Turtle Island here to listen to how we can change the funding structure, change the discrimination against our children and the inequities our children and families face when they're brought into care or when they're provided services. And our children do deserve that quality of life, Creator. And we pray that we'll listen with all of our heart today to look at what the considerations are, and also how we can uplift our children and families in ways that we can connect them with you, Creator, most importantly, but also connect them with the resources and also the people that will make those necessary changes in their life and in the world around them, in their families and in their communities and in their nations, so that they have those strong pillars of support, Creator, that's intended, that was actually in our original governance structures for our families, where we all were, the children were at the center and we were all around that child as extended family, but also a community as a whole. So you pray for that to come back in a good way. Some communities already have those systems running in their communities. They've been always there. So that it's just reaffirming and supporting that work, because all of the things that happened to our people, Creator, divided and took down the structures for our family governance, and we're rebuilding them. So please help us with that work. And just as our ancestors survived, we pray for that as well, and the adaptation and the learning that comes with that, and that we can carry our language and our culture forward. That's really important to the circle of the whole, so that we can continue practicing the ways of knowing and being that are also very holistic in learning and caring for one another and all the values that come with that, Creator. And we thank you for all of those teachings, and we thank you for the medicines, and we thank you for Mother Earth, and we thank you for the water, our source of life that is important, because we cannot live without water. And we pray that we be better caretakers. And also all our Kusaltan, our relatives, the rocks, the trees, the plants, all that we're related to, because the energy is connected with all of that in our universe and in our earthly realm. So we thank you for that, Creator. And we thank you that there's ways of grounding ourselves, and when we are feeling very sad, especially with the news of the Filipino community with the tragic event on the weekend, we pray for them and their families, that they can get the necessary support and help, and people can send them their love to know that, these tragedies are so terrible, and losing so many at once, and also the younger people that were taken away, and the compounded grief our communities have from the opioids, and the overdoses, and the sicknesses. We pray that our communities also get that support they need, the same as the Filipino communities. And moving forward, that we support one another in this work. It's for the children, it's for those families, but it's also for our future generations. So please take care of our families and the home fires, and also take care of all the leadership and all those hard workers, the directors, agencies, and all those ones that work with children and families. It's very hard work. So please take care of them as well, so that they can keep doing the great work that they do in these various circles. So we thank you, Creator. We pray for a good meeting today. And also we pray that we can take care of one another and take care of ourselves in this work. So thank you. In Cook's Jam, we thank you for our ancestors, our guardians, and our helpers, the seen and unseen. And we thank you for all that you provide us with and sustain us with. Cook's Jam, Cook's Jam, Cook's Jam, Cook's Jam. Thank you, Joni.
Thank you so much, Judy, for those words. They're really important in opening up these meetings. But I'm really excited to be joining this wonderful team. I just want to acknowledge the society, which makes up 25 Indigenous child and family service agencies across the province. So it's very exciting to join this wonderful secretariat who really supports and strengthens the voice of not only the agencies, but uplifts our most vulnerable, and that being our children, but our most resilient as well. So thank you so much once again, Judy, for those words. And I'm hoping that Regional Chief is on here. I can't see if he could join us. I know he got a new link. Kai or Michelle, could you just... Maybe I'll get into the housekeeping while we wait for Regional Chief to join us. So just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. The webinar is being recorded. And so the registered participants in this webinar will be receiving an email as well with the presentation. And also we're going to talk a little bit about at the end about the jurisdiction funding resource package that's going to be made available to all the participants. You'll also be added to the Our Children Our Way national distribution list that includes news releases, updates on future webinars, the newsletter, and also information about our two upcoming conferences that are coming up: Loving Justice, Supporting Each Other from September 8th to 11th in Prairie Park in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. And also Our Children Our Way, a national forum for Indigenous child and family well-being, November 2nd to 5th, 2025 at the Vancouver Convention Center in Vancouver. It's also important to note that it's easy to unsubscribe. You just click unsubscribe on the newsletter. And also, it's also important to note, if you'd like to receive information specific to BC, please contact the Secretariat with the email or through the website. So I just want to check and see. We want to make time for the opening words from Regional Chief. I know he wants to join because he just sent an email. So I've seen that in the corner of my... I do want to acknowledge all of the hard work that Judy had mentioned this earlier, all of the hard work of our leadership, and Regional Chief has definitely been instrumental in forwarding and supporting the voices of Indigenous children and families throughout the province. So I noticed that he's on right now, nothing like putting him on the spot the second he gets on, but we're sure excited to have Regional Chief add his voice to talking about jurisdictional frameworks and furthering the work. Regional Chief?
Hi, good morning. I was on that other link. There's other participants in that other link, so just so you know, um, I was
Thank
waiting.
you.
Um, anyways, Danny's up, Seiko's up, Sky's up. First of all, I just want to acknowledge the territory that I'm calling from, the West Bank First Nations, allowing myself to be in their territory, and certainly this morning, an important matter in terms of child welfare to talk about funding considerations, considering that this is one of the most important aspects of discrimination, where we saw much of what was discussed in terms of the long-term reform in terms of our First Nations being discriminated against uh, by the federal government over many years. So that being said, I just want to thank you all for attending today, and really talk about some of the considerations we should be considering before any long-term reform is being considered. We certainly hope that as a result of today's elections, regardless of who's in party or who is governing, that there will be a pickup of negotiations to carry on long-term reform as a part of the First Nations Child Welfare Program, and consider that there is aspects of a national discussion that needs to be had and negotiations before we carry on. Certainly respect Ontario in terms of the agreement that they finalized in January, but it is specific to Ontario's needs. That being said, we as BC have our own, I suppose, considerations in terms of child welfare, long-term reform, and considering that there are a number of tables here to implement Bill C-92 in terms of taking over child welfare jurisdiction. We do have a tripartite working group to advise in terms of how that can happen in a smooth fashion. But part of that is making sure that as we take over jurisdiction, that we are properly resourced. Um, but certainly, we need proper recognition of our First Nations as governments with inherent rights and treaty rights, and also have regional representation in terms of decision making on these critical funding issues. That being said, certainly British Columbia was concerned about the final settlement agreement, and that was rejected last October at the meeting in Calgary. As a result of the rejection of the final settlement agreement, there was a different way to start beginning, I suppose, discussions, and that became the National Children's Chiefs Commission, where we have 11 regions represented currently across this country at this table. I want to thank the chairs, co-chair Deb Foxcroft, for the work that's being done there, as well as Chief Frost from the Yukon. In February 2025, this past couple of months ago, landscape shifted again when Canada and Ontario First Nations announced their own agreement, which was approximately $8.5 billion to reform the FNCFS in Ontario, but that is specific to Ontario's needs. Certainly, approach moving forward is BC First Nations are charting our own course while staying connected to the national reform efforts. We, as a BCFN, continue to recognize and support the inherent right and jurisdiction over child welfare and families belongs to First Nations. We are now advancing a BC-specific process for long-term reform that acknowledges our unique regional realities while ensuring BC First Nations voices are heard nationally. So priorities, our work focuses on 3 critical areas: securing sustainable and adequate funding mechanisms, creating transparent processes for resource allocation, ensuring strong regional representation in all decision making. We'll continue to advocate for a funding model supporting First Nations beyond MCFD's typical funding offerings, capacity building funding to prepare for coordination agreements, transparency from MCFD and Indigenous specific fiscal data, improved data collection systems. Certainly, we need to move forward. Our approach requires a careful balance, maintaining unity in the national reform movement, addressing BC First Nation specific needs, working through the Charter working group that involves the First Nations Leadership Council, so the BCFN, Union of BC Indigenous First Nation Summit, and engaging directly with Canada on BC specific agreements. To conclude, our commitment to reform child and family services remains unwavering. The path forward must recognize First Nations inherent jurisdiction, provide sustainable funding, ensuring our voices guide decision making at every level. We continue to working toward a future where our children and families are first and thrive and supported by systems that respect our inherent rights and reflect our values as BC First Nations. I want to thank you all and thank you for the prayer to open us up in a good way, and look forward to the discussion today. So I pass it back to you, Joni. Thank you, Masai.
Masai, Regional Chief, for joining us this morning and setting the context for the discussion today. It's certainly important to talk about sustainable funding and all of the other priorities that you had mentioned. At this time, it's my honor and privilege to introduce Dr. Helaina Gaspard, and she's going to be taking us through the IFSD model and the phase 3 analysis. Are we able to start her presentation, or Helaina, are you going to be sharing your screen?
Thanks so much,
Nice
Joni.
to see you.
Nice to see you. I will happily share my screen today. Thank you very much again for the invitation to join you. And thanks to Judy and to Regional Chief Teegee for opening the session. Zoom is prompting something, so if for any reason I drop out of the meeting, I will be right back. But I hope this is okay. Okay, there we go. You should be able to see everything now. Is that clear on your end? Okay.
Looks
good.
perfect.
Okay, great. My comments today, as Joni mentioned, are to talk about IFSD's work on the phase 3 work, rather, on First Nations Child and Family Services, on blueprints or considerations for reform of the program. So IFSD is an independent research consulting firm. We sit at the University of Ottawa, and we undertook this work under contract with the Assembly of First Nations, with the support of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society, as well as what was formerly the NAC at the start of the project. So just to be really clear, anything I talk about today does not necessarily represent the views of the AFM, doesn't necessarily represent the views of the collaborators that I'll speak to, or I'll speak about shortly, that supported this work, that contributed this work, that helped to shape this work. So our role for phase 3 was to take lessons and learnings from prior phases of work and to test them out, right? So this was all about helping to ensure that that we had the right mix of information, that the funding principles worked in practice, and that we had explored ways of applying the Measuring to Thrive framework, as well as considering transition and what that meant for different types of service providers. We were very fortunate that we had the opportunity to work with 20 collaborators, and the 20 collaborators were a mix of existing FNCFS agencies and First Nations who are contemplating or who are actively engaged in jurisdiction. They were an exceptional group that contributed their expertise, that shared their knowledge, that helped to identify what worked, that helped to showcase what didn't. They spent a lot of time with us individually, I mean, one-on-one, as organizations or as First Nations, but also as a group. And you'll see their work, you'll see their recommendations reflected throughout the report. You'll actually note different sections in the report where we highlight their different perspectives. For instance, the collaborators had their own set of recommendations that differed from IFSD's recommendations. We actually had a collaborator who dissented to IFSD's approach, completely disagreed with the very premise that we were even answering a question on how to reform the FNCFS program, and their dissent is in the report. So we think that these are, helpful and important contributions because they reflect the diversity of viewpoints. So we are very, very grateful for these contributions, and also to how they help to shape the work, how they help to shape and refine the approach.
Helaina,
Yes.
sorry, I'm just going to interrupt. We just have a participant say that you're difficult to hear. I can hear you, so I just want to check in with everybody. I know Dr. Gaspard is soft-spoken, so maybe she has to get her potlatch voice.
I'll speak. I'll use my diaphragm or whatever I'm supposed to do to project the sound of my voice. Is that any better? Let me see if I can leave. Is that better? Okay, I can do that. I will be.
Okay.
Volume is good.
Folks are weighing in saying they can hear you. Awesome.
Okay.
Sorry.
No problem. No. Very important. No sense in doing a presentation if no one can hear us. IFSD's work builds on prior phases of work. So phase one, for instance, that was all about gaps in the system, what those gaps would cost. All of that information came from FNCFS agencies. We actually had about 75% of existing agencies participate, share their data for that work. In phase two, working with agencies, working with First Nations, that's where we started to think about an alternative approach to child and family services. That's where we start to see this alternative funding approach, as well as the Measuring to Thrive framework emerge. And then finally, in phase three, we tested and refined those concepts, those approaches that were developed in phase two. And one of the really important pieces that came out of phase three, that came from several collaborators, was that the hardest work is yet to come. It's so important that these pieces are in place. It's great to have tools, but the actual work of implementation is what is challenging, what is exciting, what is, full of opportunity, and also sometimes unexpected consequences, unexpected results. And that balancing those questions, especially in the context of transition, is so important. And it's so important to be practical about those realities. And I'll speak a little bit more about that toward the end of the presentation. So when we consider the current breakdown of the population, most First Nations now are served by an agency. So it's roughly, and I say very roughly, it's about an 80-20 split when we talk about service delivery between First Nations living in their communities, and I'm only speaking about First Nations living in their communities right now. So about 80% of the total population, not number of First Nations, but total population is served by an agency. The balance has either exercised jurisdiction, is not affiliated, or is in the process of jurisdiction. And of course, these numbers will shift, these numbers will change, but for us, the composition of the current population or of the current context is really important because it helps to understand or helps us to frame where we need to place our efforts, right? And so we talk a lot about jurisdiction. That's crucial, that's important, but we also can't fail to recognize that the majority of First Nations are still being served by an agency. IFSD's work is grounded in the two orders from the CHRT, right? End discrimination, ensure discrimination does not reoccur. And for us, because we approach these questions from a public financial management perspective, this means using tools to help address these considerations. So I know several of you that we've worked with or that we've met that are on this call, we are not experts in child and family services. We work in public finance. And so that means for us, when we're approaching the question of FNCFS program reform, that means we're thinking about a number of different things. That means we're principally thinking about the structure of the program. So what are the rules of the program? How do they impact people that are working through the program, that are engaging with the program? That means we're also worried about funding. Are the resources commensurate to the mandate of the program? Are the resources commensurate to the mandates of the people accountable for delivering the program? And then finally, how do we know if this is working? Do we have an accountability mechanism in place so that we can figure out if the structure of the program and the funding of the program work well together to actually deliver results for children, deliver results for families? So I'm going to speak in 4 blocks today. I'll talk about structure, I'll talk about funding, I'll talk about accountability, and then I'll talk about transition. And then hopefully we can have more than enough time for questions and discussion at the end. So when we're talking about structure, as I mentioned, we're talking about rules, we're talking about incentives, we're talking about these elements, whether they're in a law, whether they're in a program, that guide the way a policy, the way a program, the way the actors or the people that are engaging with that structure will arrange their behavior. And we saw a huge change, a rather significant change from the time that we started this work, because when we were doing phase 1, we could actually demonstrate very clearly that the size of an agency's budget had a very strong connection, almost perfect connection, to the number of children in care. So that means to us, from a public finance perspective, that the system was structured in a way that incented children to be placed in care to unlock resources, which is exactly what agency directors, what agency staff were explaining to us. That was the way it worked. Whether or not that was the best tool, that was the tool that was available to them to get resources to support kids and families. So we saw that in phase 1. Now we're in a different situation, right? The expenditure level, so the funding amounts are different. The rules of the game are different. And we're expecting that over time, we're going to see changes in results for kids, right? This is not about the number of children in care. You folks will know that better than anyone. This is about how kids are doing and how service providers, whether it's an agency, whether it's a First Nation, have the parameters, have the tools around them to meet the best interests of children. So when we think about change in structure from a public finance perspective, and we link it to the 2 orders of the CHRT to end discrimination and ensure discrimination does not reoccur, there are a few things that need to get done. Whether we're talking about this from a federal perspective, changing the FNCFS program, or whether we're talking about a reform at a provincial level, these are considerations that you might want to keep in mind. First and foremost, you need a policy change. That is the direction, the decision, and the vision of a government. You need the policy to change. What is the purpose? What is the problem we're trying to solve in child and family services? And what's the statement that helps to guide that work? Then we have to change the regulations, right? Those are the rules of the game. What are you allowed to do? What are you not allowed to do? What is eligible for reimbursement? What's not eligible for reimbursement? So all of those technical components. Who is eligible to deliver services, relative to, say, a federal program? So things like the policy change and regulatory change, those pieces can help us ensure we end discrimination. Because you can manage things like funding levels. You can manage things like the spirit and intent of a policy, of a law, of a program. You can do those things. Ensuring discrimination does not reoccur still requires the policy and regulatory change, but then you need a whole bunch of other pieces, different components that help you to measure and monitor what's happening with children, what is happening with families, what they are, how they're changing, right? Whether or not their needs are being met. And so that means we need things like measures that actually matter, that reflect the realities of children and families. That's what we call a performance framework. When we talk about First Nations care and control and delivery of information, of services, of all of those things, those are considerations that matter when it comes to ensuring discrimination does not reoccur, because we're changing the way the program is structured, for changing the incentives that exist in the program. And then, of course, considering transition time. We cannot underestimate the time for transition. And our collaborators were very, very clear about that. They indicated that for established organizations like agencies that have been operational, that have existing practices, staff, tools, resources, all of those sorts of things, they said it could be anywhere from 2 to 5 years to fully absorb a change. If you were starting from zero, our group of collaborators estimated 10 to 15 years or beyond to actually implement a complete approach to jurisdiction. And so those are considerations for us that are very important to keep in mind, especially when we know that system structures don't change easily, they don't change willingly. And I thank you for the note about the rules of the game. That's just those are technical words that come from a particular literature. So I'll be mindful of that when I say rules of the game. That's just a question of incentives. But thank you for the note, Bernadette, about talking about mechanisms to restore pathways to practice that are better suited to children and families. So when we talk about funding next, right? So structure, those are the parameters, those are the guidelines, those are the rules that are intended to get us to a better place to restoring that wellness for children and families, right? So that's the frame effectively that we're playing in. In order to give that meaning, in order to execute on those mandates, to execute on those functions, we need resources. Resources have to flow. So there's a lot of focus, I find, when we talk about the reform of child and family services, the reform of the program, on the amount of money. Money, funding is a crucial and critical tool, but on its own, it's not going to solve the problem. And so that's why for us, when we're talking about reform, and you'll see in the report, we emphasize very clearly, this is, yes, about money, but money alone is not going to change realities, results for children. It needs that change in structure. It also needs we also need a way to help ensure that that money, that funding, and that the structure of, or new structure of a program, the new structure of service delivery is actually meeting the needs of children. And that's a really important consideration here. So when we look at funding estimates, our work in phase 3 focuses exclusively on existing FNCFS agencies. That's really important. So we are not, in the numbers that I'm talking about here, we're not talking about funding for jurisdiction. We're not talking about funding for First Nations not affiliated to an FNCFS agency. For First Nations not affiliated to an FNCFS agency, there's a separate piece of work that IFSD completed. That's on our website. I'm happy to make sure you have the link to that report. That has a separate set of considerations. It has separate cost estimates, because First Nations that are not affiliated to an agency have a very different operating context, have very different starting points than agencies that are operational and actively providing services. In our work, IFSD's funding approach and the allocation that it generates, so the approach, so the principles of how a funding amount should be generated, and that amount of money is meant to be understood holistically, so all together. And I really want to emphasize this point. When the components of the funding approach, say prevention or IT or supplements for poverty or deprivation, are pulled apart and are split up between different entities, we can no longer speak to the sufficiency of that amount of money, nor can we speak to the relevance of that funding approach anymore, because the very premise of the funding approach has been taken apart. So when IFSD developed this work with agencies and with actual data from agencies, it was the baseline, or the operating baseline, the existing expenditures of an agency, that we used as the starting point. That means that IFSD assumed that was built into that budget an existing operating baseline. So from that operating baseline, we added these components. We add the components separately to help show and tie the components to context. to the different contexts of the First Nations that are being served. But that funding approach and the notional money that comes from it were meant to be understood all together. And once that number was generated, we no longer saw the components as separate. So even though we would calculate a funding allocation with a baseline, with an allocation for prevention, with a consideration of geography, of poverty or deprivation, and so on and so forth, once that number was generated, as far as we were concerned, the amount of money that came from that funding approach should be transferred as a block to the service provider. And the service provider who takes the risk for service delivery should also have the benefit of applying those resources however they see fit. And that for us is a really important way, or one of the ways, that structure and funding fit together. So these are the numbers here. And when we generate these numbers, there are very important exclusions. And I'm only showing here up on the screen what we call IFSD's recommended approach to funding to the allocation model. All of the work, all of the assumptions, all of the components, the different options for the components are all in the report. We even walk through in the report how different service providers, whether it's an agency or a First Nation exercising jurisdiction, might wish to use these findings. We actually walk through a mock example of how you can use the funding approach to generate estimates, how you can use the funding approach to help generate a second data point, if you will, on what a funding approach might look like, how you might compare it to another. So these numbers broken out on a regional basis on a 5-year profile, generate about $17.5 billion over 5 years for the model that is only for FNCFS agencies, existing FNCFS agencies. That allocation excludes post-majority supports and services. It excludes the First Nations representative service because we assume that goes to First Nations directly. And it also excludes capital because IFSD's recommendation is that capital be funded through a national pool on an application basis because the capital needs across the board in FNCFS are very different. So when I mentioned that different combinations are possible, we present different combinations in the report. We present a yellow high scenario. You'll see IFSD's scenario in red, a medium scenario, and a low scenario. They have different combinations of those components that make up the funding approach. But the real important element for us is that funding approach is meant to be understood holistically and is meant to be read together. Because once you pull those pieces apart, the funding approach itself no longer that loses its internal reference, right? Because we use the baseline to calculate certain top-ups. Say IT is a great example. Industry standards for IT are that for a not-for-profit organization, they should be spending somewhere between 5 to 6% of their baseline operating budget on IT. So if we take 5 to 6% of an FNCFS agency's budget, right, the value of that 5 to 6%, and we add that to a funding approach, that component is relevant and is calculated relative to that agency's own budget. If we take that 5 or 6% for an IT allocation and we're calculating it against a different baseline, or we're calculating it against some other baseline that might not be in reference to or might not be directly connected to the service provider, that allocation no longer makes sense. And so that's our concern here, is that when this funding approach was built, these pieces are pieces of a puzzle that fit together to make a whole, right? And they fit together because they're intended to link to the different contexts, the different starting points of First Nations. So prevention, for instance, that component is calculated on a population basis. That 2,500 for a prevention service model actually comes from an existing operating agency in BC. And they had a life cycle approach to prevention service delivery. All of the details, including the specific activities that are included in that per capita allocation, are all published in our first report. And so we're very specific about how each of these components tie to the organization that's being funded or tied to the context in which they're operating. So population is a great example of context. Geography, another good example of context. And then we have relative top-ups, things like IT or a results component that are tied to the baseline operating budget of the existing organization. So just something important from our perspective to keep in mind when we talk about a funding approach is only the principles are helpful guides, but it's important to consider how funding approaches are developed and what problem they were actually asked to solve or what questions they were asked to answer. So next are considerations of accountability. So when we think about the structure of the FNCFS program, we think about funding associated to the program, we have to know whether or not that funding and that structure work together to actually generate results. And I'll just pause here for one quick second. The 5 to 6%, that's for an IT allocation. And so there are different ways that we can apply the estimate in the funding approach. When IFSD does it in its work, we do it on a yearly basis relative to the agency's operating budget. I hope that answers the question. And Bryce, you're asking the question about in phase 1 for prevention, the per capita funding was rounded down. That had, I'm not sure it would be major. We're looking at about $64, $63. We used the 2,500 because that actually captured the activities associated to the elements that we were concerned with. We also presented that 2,500 with 2 other cases. One case where a First Nation didn't have an agency, talked about their prevention allocations, or rather their prevention activities. We also asked them to generate a case and estimate the costs with us of what they could do if they had everything they needed, and they got to approximately 2,000 per person. So that 2,500 for us is a pretty good reflection of the activities that were being undertaken by the agency. And so it's also important to keep in mind that 2,500 sits on top of an existing operating baseline. So we're not saying take the 2,500 in isolation, which I understand is happening now, where that 2,500 is being split up between different entities. For us, that 2,500 per person actually sits on top the operating budget of an existing agency. And that's why those prevention resources were quite meaningful when you consider it on a per capita basis. Those prevention resources were also adjusted annually for inflation to help keep those dollars relevant. I hope that answers the question. So when we're talking about accountability in child and family services, we're really asking, or we should be answering the question of how the children are doing. And for a long time, when we look at, say, the federal program, we were very focused on how many children were in care. We were also very focused on, and still are in a number of different ways, we're still focused on how much money is being flowed. And that for us is insufficient if you're thinking about the CHRT's orders to end discrimination and ensure discrimination does not reoccur. So in order to ensure that discrimination does not reoccur, we actually have to ask the question, and we have to be able to answer the question of how are the children doing? Because where we're starting from, we would consider a baseline. That's our starting point. We want to know over time, are children and families better off than they were today? Are they worse off? And we want to know why. And that for us is tied to well-being. And that comes out of the Measuring to Thrive framework that was developed by FNCFS agency directors, and that has all kinds of existing peer-reviewed research to underpin it. And so when we're talking about accountability in this work, we're looking to ensure that we're measuring and monitoring what matters for children and families. And so Measuring to Thrive is a starting point for that. In the work that we did with collaborators in phase 3, we worked with collaborators to identify a subset of indicators for measuring to thrive, one that collaborators thought would be appropriate for ISC, and I'll speak to those next. And then the collaborators identified a subset of indicators that they thought would be relevant for them and their work in reporting back to the First Nations, to the communities that they serve, and also to relevant to reporting on results relative to, say, federal funding in our case, because that's what our work was concerned with, was the federal program. So when we think about measuring and monitoring what matters, there are two components in answering that question. We are looking for what is happening, and we're also looking to answer why it's happening. When we look at what is happening, that's where something like measuring to thrive can be really helpful, because it helps us track across time a series of indicators that are connected to CFS and to outcomes for children. So it tells us what we're looking at, right? It might talk about rates of family reunification. We might look at access to potable water flowing from source to tap. We might consider things like changes in broadband access in the community, a whole host of other factors that are both at the level of the community, of the child, of the family. That tells us what's happening and what's changing, but why those things are happening, that will only ever come from communities, that will only ever come from the people who are doing the work on the ground. And so for us, when we talk about accountability and we're talking about measurement when it comes to service delivery, we need those two components and we need them to work well together. So I'll speak to what we did in the context of phase 3. And with collaborators, when we started talking about this idea of measurement, what it might look like to put it into practice, the collaborators were very clear that when it comes to the federal government's obligations for reporting in relation to CFS, they should actually be reporting on the structural drivers of contact with protective services for which they have accountability. So that means housing, that means potable water, that means things like a livable income, that means access to services. That also means looking at rates of family reunification. And so these indicators from the collaborators' perspectives were quite helpful, because ISC itself is not a service provider. ISC doesn't deliver services. ISC transfers resources to agencies, to First Nations, to deliver child and family services. If ISC itself is not the service provider, why are they asking questions that a service provider itself should be looking at internally? ISC should actually be looking at the factors that influence service delivery, because it's the factors around the child, around the families, that are influencing outcomes for children and kids, that are influencing the way that service providers are able to do their work, or that are in which they experience challenges in doing their work. So I will just pause for a moment here and say, the idea of starting to measure and starting to monitor is actually really hard. When we worked with the collaborators, this was probably one of the most humbling portions for me of this entire project. We were confronted with what I thought was going to be a fairly straightforward exercise, one that was not at all straightforward. We actually threw away a software tool that we had built to capture information, and we went back to the basics. We agreed generally on the indicators that we were going to test out. But the big problem for us, the big gap that we found, was that while information was being gathered across service providers and some First Nations, not all, the way information was being gathered was completely different. So everyone was speaking a different language when it came to measuring and monitoring. So we had to find a way to get everyone on the same page in the way that they organized and coded their information, so that we could work together to test out what using that information would look like, how that information could help us tell a story. And so we actually had to go back to zero in some ways and rebuild all of that. The collaborators did that. They identified the indicators, they produced definitions, they identified different sources of information for those indicators. And then for many of them, they actually took past data, right? They stripped all of the identifiers, they recoded their own data, and then we ran an exercise together using the script that's available through the AFN, and using the tools that are available through this report to help make sense of that data, to help make sense of what we were seeing, right? To answer the question of what was happening with children and families. You'll note here that we present 5 indicators that we think could be a potential starting point. We recognize that these are heavily focused on protection, and there's a good reason for it. That's the information that we principally have right now. It doesn't mean that that's the information that we'll have moving forward or that will be available for service providers for First Nations moving forward, but this was our starting point. And from our perspective, it was so important to try out, right? To try out an approach, to understand what a potential approach would look like if it were to be rolled out nationally, if it were to be rolled out among a group of agencies, or maybe even on a provincial or regional basis. And so testing that out and being able to answer that question was very valuable for the process, and we hope, very valuable, producing valuable lessons for others who might be engaging with these questions of measurement. And so these are 5 indicators that we think could be a potential starting point, but that also have information on the ready that can be used. And so you'll see in the report, we were really clear about it. We were clear about how hard it was. We were clear about what we did to address the challenges with which we were confronted. And we actually present all of the tools there. You can see, for instance, the data coding framework that was used. And you can also see the way, for some collaborators, they were interested in coding things like language access. They wanted to code things like engagement with cultural activities in the community. And what we really valued about the approach that was taken here, the event-based approach that was used here, was that you could add, as a service provider, as much detail as you thought was helpful or relevant for your community, for your organization. And so all of those considerations are detailed in the report. And a big and huge thanks and recognition to the collaborators for what they did on this front. This was a massive effort being able to do this. And I will say too, we learned from others who had done this in the past. We worked with Dr. Fred Woolchin from the University of Chicago, who's affiliated to Chapin Hall, and they run a child welfare data center at Chapin Hall, where various US states use an event-based approach to code their data, and Chapin Hall helps them make sense of it. We also see other groups like the Thunderbird Partnership Foundation in Canada that supports Indigenous addictions treatment facilities, and the Thunderbird Partnership Foundation developed their very own Native wellness assessment tool, and that's individual based, and it's focused on positive sources of change and on positive sources of development, or focus on positive development for those that are at centers and working on their addictions treatment. And the Thunderbird Partnership Foundation provides support to the organizations that use that tool, provides support on the data capture, and also helps them use that information to present a portrait of how things are changing across the group of centers. And so those for us are helpful examples of why information is so important and how information can be used by First Nations, for First Nations, by First Nations organizations with the support of their First Nations, to get to not only a better understanding of what's happening now, but to support better decision making over time, and certainly to support better advocacy over time. I'll just make a note here before moving on to a discussion of the transition considerations of the report about questions for a provincial government in CFS. And we had a collaborator who asked the question, we're about to engage with the province. How do we figure out where to start, in anticipating discussions on jurisdiction? And we developed these questions for them that they encouraged us to share in case they would be useful to others. And for us, these are basic questions, at least from a public financial management perspective, that we would want answered, because it helps to understand the structure of the system. It helps to understand funding considerations in the system, and whether or not there are performance considerations that are tied to the well-being of children. And so on their face, we would assume these questions should be quite easy to answer. In fact, what we found, not only in this work, but in other work, these questions are not necessarily straightforward to answer, especially when it comes to distinctions-based analysis in the provinces and territories in some situations. So it's hard to distinguish where resources are flowing, how First Nations children specifically are doing, and whether or not those resources are sufficient to meet the needs of children and families, and how children are doing over time. And so we think that these are helpful questions to ask, of course, among others, I'm sure. But this to us would be a good starting point, especially if you were contemplating jurisdiction, or if you were looking to better understand information and access to information, what information is being gathered, and how it's positioned within the province. We think that these are helpful questions that should be asked. And there's no reason why these questions shouldn't be answered. And when we're talking about funding from a government, that's a matter of public interest. And it's also money itself, and the way resources are allocated can be a very helpful tool to assess whether a government does what it says and says what it, or means what it says. And I think especially when we consider a province like British Columbia that has made massive efforts to engage with Indigenous peoples, to uphold at a provincial level different considerations, different components of agreements, of different commitments. I think it's really important to be able to answer these questions, because in some work we did for the Representative for Children and Youth all the way back to 2021 now, we actually had no idea how First Nations children were doing in care. Resources couldn't be disaggregated on a First Nations basis either, at least from our work. And so those are important gaps in understanding when a government is saying we are committed, when a government is saying, we want to do better. When you ask people that, like us, that look at this from a public finance perspective, when you sort of lift the hood of the car, we want to know, does it match? Are you actually making the changes that will help the car run better? Are you actually committed to doing that, or are you just saying it? And so for us, using money, using indicators for measurement, looking at changes in policies, changes in structures, are very good ways of assessing whether the funding allocation matches the political commitment or the political statement. And that's why we hope these questions are useful. So finally now, onto transition. This is what one collaborator said to us about transition, and we actually spent quite a bit of time with him on this matter, and it was quite impactful, because for people on the ground who do this day to day, they recognized and appreciated the opportunity, but also the complexity of what it means to make change, to absorb a change, but to maintain a change as well. And for this collaborator, it was clear. They said they think this transition is going to be easy, and it's not. And that gave us pause, because you can have the best laid plans on paper, you can have the finest piece of legislation that's ever been written, but unless you can action that, unless you have the people and the systems and the processes and the tools to make this change happen and to sustain it, it becomes really different. It can be very difficult to take that well-meaning, well-written piece of legislation and turn it into a result. And so for us, the transition question is quite an important one. And so in our work, we identify three broad clusters of collaborators. So we have agencies that are serving a First Nation exercising jurisdiction, whether or not that agency would be brought in-house. We have First Nations starting from zero who are exercising jurisdiction, and we included First Nations not affiliated to an FNCFS agency. When we consider their capacities for service delivery, for funding, and for reporting, you can see very quickly it changes. When you're an existing service provider, you have a mandate and oftentimes legal obligations to provide services to children and families. So we know that you're set up with the people, the practices, the processes, the systems, the tools to be able to discharge your mandate. We also know that you have some sense of what funding is needed and what funding you already have. Where it becomes much harder for agencies is on the reporting side. There is a lot of reporting that agencies are doing, but not all of it is necessarily focused or targeting well-being, let alone change over time. We know that agencies are responding to provincial data requirements, federal data requirements, and the utility of that reporting is not always clear. When it comes to First Nations exercising jurisdiction, there's a great deal of inconsistency that we found. And not only in the collaborator group in terms of starting points, but in others that have engaged with us throughout this project. So given the inconsistency in starting points, it's really hard to say as a group or as a collaborator type where First Nations are starting from. It's variable. What we can say, however, is that for First Nations that are not affiliated to an agency, there's a great deal of mix when it comes to service delivery. We were very clear about that variability and capacity for service delivery in our separate report. But the two components that really stood out for us was that funding was a huge challenge. Very few First Nations not affiliated to an FNCFS agency could indicate consistency in funding for CFS, could identify a consistent allocation for CFS, let alone report on results for kids and families. And so this starting point for us is crucial because we want to make sure people are set up for success when these transitions are happening. And we can't pretend, right? We can't ignore starting points. We can't ignore current contexts. We should also be aware that different collaborators have had a different period of time, have had different tools, have had different opportunities to be able to develop their capacity, develop their staffing, develop their plans. All of these things matter when you're trying to absorb change and you're planning to absorb change. And so what we can see, right, is how diverse starting points are for service providers. When we look at that first box, that starting point is impacted by politics, by housing, by water, by culture, by language, by all kinds of things. And so First Nations and FNCFS agencies have this wonderful diversity of starting points, but those starting points are going to inform their capacity, their approach to managing transition. And so for us, transition from where we sit, it's important to think about your strategy. What's your mission? What are your priorities? What's your mandate? How does it fit with your culture? How does it fit with your community? Then once you've got that strategy set, what systems are you going to use? How do you pay people? How do you track information? How are you governed? To whom are you accountable? And then you have all of the processes, right? How do you actually deliver services? What services are you going to deliver? Which staff are accountable for doing what? And then you've got your people. And for CFS, that is a people-focused service area, right? Children, families, absolutely, but also internally, these organizations, these teams are heavily focused on people and the people doing the work. So where are you finding your staff? How are you recruiting? Who are you recruiting? Are you able to retain your staff? Do they have the training they need? Do they have the support they need? Are you able to be competitive relative to similar employers? Can you keep your staff around? And so putting those pieces together from your starting point with those considerations for transition will help you get eventually to that desired future state. But that doesn't happen overnight. And we spend a lot of time in the report walking through those different components and using examples that the collaborators themselves shared to talk about their experiences with transition, to talk about what they did to get through and to walk through those steps. We, have different examples of collaborators with very different starting points, of First Nations that have very different starting points. What did they do? How did they do it? Some collaborators are working with their First Nations to exercise jurisdiction with the agency coming in-house. What does that mean in terms of a jumpstart on service delivery? What does that mean in terms of staff retention? Will we be able to do that if we're working under a different law? What does that mean for our staff's training? So these are all questions that are live and that have this, cascading effect when certain decisions are made. And that's why when we think about transition and we think about the importance of sustainable reform, it's crucial from what we learned from collaborators from others that those delivering services are deliberate in their approach to planning for transition. There's no risk-free change. There's certainly no risk-free way of engaging in transition, let alone in delivering child and family services. But there are ways of mitigating those impacts. And time is one of them. Information is another. Seeking out those that have engaged in change, those that have successfully managed transition, are all so important to reach out to learn from. And so for us, what we were so grateful to have learned from so many in phase 3 is a starting point. The number of times in the last year that I have connected colleagues that are looking at similar questions has been incredible. And to us, it's that richness of the community, the richness of the experiences that are necessary and so important in planning and in anticipating transition. And so when we think about a sustainable reform, we have to be mindful of those structural drivers of contact with protection services, how that connects to a law, how that connects to practice and practice guidelines, and also to how those structural drivers connect to approaches in prevention and prevention services to help keep children and families supported and ideally out of protective services if protection services are not the best way forward for them or are not needed for them. And so all of this, the complexity of it is in part a reflection of, you know, the richness of community realities, the complexity of community realities, and those should be recognized when people are thinking about change, when people are thinking about transition, and certainly thinking about how to connect those pieces of the puzzle in the best interest of children and families. And so, Joni, I'll pause there, and hopefully there are questions and folks are still on the line with ideas and questions to share too.
Absolutely. And we've also had folks weighing in as you've been speaking to the entire group, but we actually had a few folks already ask some questions, so prepared questions. Maybe we'll start with those first, Helaina, and then we'll move on to the larger group. So the first question would be, how would you see nations or individual service providers being able to adapt the Measuring to Thrive framework to align with their worldviews and their norms while still maintaining the ability to tell collective stories across nations / service providers?
So I think this is a helpful question because it gets back to that idea of what we're looking at when we're measuring. We're often trying to answer two questions. What are we seeing? What are the trends? What are the changes? And why are we seeing them? And I think Measuring to Thrive can help us monitor the what. What are we seeing? What are we seeing in terms of community baselines, right? Can we set a starting point for our community? How does our community change over time? How are our children doing? How are our children changing over time? That helps us to see what is happening and what elements are changing from that set of indicators, looking at them quantitatively. But why those things are happening have to come from the stories of First Nations. And certainly from where we sit, we don't see those two things as separate at all. We see them as working together, and they should work together. We hope that you see in our work, we put them together too. We use a lot of quantitative data that comes from First Nation organizations, First Nations, other sources, but it's the stories and the sense making that give meaning to those numbers, because those trends or the what we see over time means nothing if we don't know why. So for instance, if we see an increase in family reunification, right? We might say, well, we see the family reunification rates increasing, but why are those family reunification rates increasing, right? Somebody like me would start to say, what's happening in the community, right? Are economics a little bit more stable? Are parents doing better? Are parents feeling more confident? Are service providers equipped with tools to do more, to do better, to do different things. And so asking those questions means getting people to tell you stories or having people share stories. And that comes from staff, that comes from community members, that comes from the people who are actually engaging with those services. And that's where we hope that there will be that connection between the what and the why. And we think that those come from important, but sometimes different places. I hope that's helpful, Joe.
Perfectly. Thank you so much. The next question we have is, so much of our work locally depends on good partnerships with the federal and provincial government and them upholding their accountabilities. What do you see as their obligations to report publicly on their parts of this important work?
Sure. Sometimes the best place to start is what they're accountable for right now. And I can use the federal government as in this case as an example. The federal government every year has to report on the outcomes for its programs. There are actual policies in place for the federal government that require that the way money is spent and the results that are generated from programs are presented to Parliament. And when they say presented to Parliament, that means made public for Canadians. They don't do a very good job of that as far as we're concerned when it comes to CFS. And so having them uphold their obligations, we think can even start with the obligations that they impose on themselves. And so getting that clarity around what's being spent, where, how, with what result is really important. And I think even starting there is a good place to start, because I think BC too, a great example. The government of BC talks a lot about reconciliation, has taken really important steps in that regard. But again, when you ask the question, how are First Nations children doing if they're in care? How are First Nations children being funded if they're in care? From where we sit, we can't find the answers to those questions. And so we think that there is an important consideration of linking the narrative or the commitment to what's actually being done in practice or behind the scenes.
Thank you. The next question is, the reality is that a lot of help is needed on the ground with systems development, indicator development, and data collection. This can also benefit from economies of scale for efficiency purposes. What do you see as the potential solutions to help nations build capacity locally, but also collaborate on these common practical needs?
That's definitely something that we've seen as a current in the work since phase one. And from where we sit, we think there needs to be some kind of, we use the word secretariat, call it something different, but it's a place that has the capacity and that can support First Nations, that can support agencies. And for us, really two different ways. One is on the data gathering and on the data analysis side, and the other is on the practice side. I see that there's a question in the chat about, priority service areas for family preservation, as an example. That's a great example of something a secretariat could support, right? If it was a holder of best practices, you could look to the secretariat and say, okay, well, who's working on family preservation? Does Carrier-Sekeni still have their intensive family reunification support program? Does MCN in Northern Manitoba still have the removal of parents program? Can they tell us about what results they had? Can they tell us about the number of people they needed, how they trained their staff, all of those sorts of things? That to us is one way a secretariat could help. The other, on the data gathering and analysis side, I mentioned those two examples of Chapin Hall and the Thunderbird Partnership Foundation. Those to us are very are helpful examples of ways that separate organizations can support service providers, not in doing the data gathering for them, not in taking their information, but in helping them make sense of their information. And that for us thinks that from our perspective, that for us is a very important place for leverage, because lots of organizations are asking the same question. And whether that can be done on a regional basis or whether that's done both at a regional basis and at a national level, those are, we think, really helpful things that should be reflected on as reform continues to move forward.
Absolutely. So those were the end of our previous questions previously submitted, but you did touch on Bernadette's question in your extensive research. What are the priority service areas for family preservation? Did you want to add anything further, Helaina?
Sorry, what I would say about that, there are people much better than us to speak to. Sorry, my coffee went down the wrong way. To speak to family preservation. And we'd be happy to point you to service providers who are doing this, who have shared these practices with us, and we would certainly point you there. So please feel free to get in touch, and we'd be happy to connect you out from there. I also see another question in the chat, Joni.
Yeah,
Can
there's
I
another
just-
one.
Can
Oh,
I just expand on my question? So, Helaina, I was building on your first slide that recognizes that laws and policies have to take us outside of the mainstream service framework. So family preservation isn't what I'm talking about. It's more around the costing tool that identifies the holistic range of services that are required, including family preservation. So if we were going to get out of the mold of the Child and Family Services Act, whatever iteration it is in every province, because we're moving out of the family, the child protection framework for Indigenous families, because it really does lock us in to a specific focus of intervention, including family preservation and removing the parents approach, which isn't a life cycle approach, because it's not just the life cycle of the child that we're looking at. We're looking at an intergenerational life cycle, because the parents have been harmed by the system already, and the social workers are harmed. And, First Nations agencies are limited in their framework if they continue to work within the confines of the legislation. But I'm just wondering about when you did your research and consultation, if there were any priorities for the type of services that First Nations could develop in their own communities, because we can't look to specialists trained outside of that context.
So Bernadette, I'll answer your question from the work that we did and the work we were asked to do. So what I hear you saying is you are asking the question of how do you apply resources to get different results for children and families done in your own way, whatever way that might be to best meet the needs of kids and families. And we see when a service provider can apply resources the way they see fit, we actually see a difference in results. And we have an example here from West Region Child and Family Services, who actually did a block prevention pilot years ago. And they could actually show that kids and families were better off when they, as the service provider, could determine how to allocate their resources. So that examples from other jurisdictions, as well as our own work from a public financial management perspective, that's all why we make the recommendation for a block fund approach. That if resources in the block are sufficient to discharge a mandate, it should be up to the service provider to use those resources to fulfill its obligation. And that obligation might be different, Bernadette, in a reformed system to promote the well-being of children and families and communities. And that's why we think a block approach can be helpful, because at the end of the day, the service provider who is ever delivering the services maintains all of the risk. They hold all of the risk. We think that that service provider should also be empowered to help make decisions in the best interests of children and families, and to help ensure that they're designing and delivering services in ways that best meet the needs of their communities.
Okay, and the last question that we have here in regards to implementation and transition, have other First Nations organizations seen a growth in their organizations to be able to support this good work? Was capacity building needed from the beginning? And you spoke to that at the onset of your discussion.
I think it's a helpful question because things will change, right, as your service practices and parameters are changing. And what we learned from collaborators is that yes, capacity development always needed, but it's not just in the moment. It's actually being able to anticipate what those capacity changes might be, what those changing needs might be from a staffing perspective, and also to providing opportunities to develop those capacities within your own communities. And there are really interesting examples of different communities that have supported this kind of capacity development, whether it's through existing social work programs and buying out cohorts of those social work programs, or whether it's working with elders in the community to help support children and families who might need a little bit of extra wraparound supports or services, or who might benefit from a cultural intervention. And so those are considerations that we think merit attention, but definitely capacity, staffing needed from the beginning, but not necessarily all at once, depending on the types of services you're delivering and how those activities are being rolled out over time.
Helaina, I think that really speaks to the fact that some agencies have been in the service delivery for 30 some years, building slowly the capacities in which to meet, knowing that the North Star, the end game, was going to be moving to a further to be developing their own laws. And I think County Family Services is a good example of that, because they were building piecemeal to be able to address from their own perspective and from the wisdom of their matriarch, saying this is exactly what we need in order to keep children out of care. So there are definite examples, and that's what Our Children Our Way here can definitely link agencies, because there's some really great programs, wise practices that are already being implemented throughout the province. And so you spoke very well to that, so thank you. Bryce says, with services being provided both by First Nations and agencies under current CHRT orders for a few years, has IFSD been part of any data collection to assess the impacts of this changed approach to service delivery using the Measuring to Thrive indicators?
So it's a good question, Bryce. So phase 3 actually tested out those indicators. And so in the phase 3 report, there are different examples of agencies actually who are using Measuring to Thrive in different ways. Pegani Child and Family Services in Alberta is using it to capture its prevention-oriented services. Carrier Sekani is using it in a number of different ways. There are other agencies and other collaborators who are not named in the report, but you can see how they've applied the tool in different ways. Sometimes it's to establish a baseline. Sometimes it's to help them inform their own data gathering tools for change. But the phase 3 test was the first time that we had done it with a group of collaborators, but we know that others are using it on an individual basis in different ways.
Thank you so much. I'm just going through here, and I know Bryce had asked if IFSD has released the phase 3, if it's been released, and Kai was able to put the link on there for the updates on your website. So I think that's a helpful link as well. And also for further information for those unaffiliated nations as well, there's more specific information specific to the unaffiliated nations. So I think those are helpful links as well. And I just wanted to note those.
Absolutely. Thanks for doing that, Joni. So just for everyone's information, in the call today, the phase 3 report is just going through its formatting and its copy editing. And so we'll have the full and final version up on the website. There won't be substantive changes to content, but hopefully it'll be a little bit clearer for everybody reading it. So we'll make sure that we note when that full and final and formatted report is up.
Wonderful. So we do have a bit of time that we just wanted to bring to your attention on the very last. Oh, Bryce has another question. Do you have any recommendations on how to use the IFSD reports in negotiating coordination agreements under C92?
The questions are great. Keeps everything, I think, keeps everything interesting and hopefully too helpful and applicable, Bryce. So there are a few different parts of the work, especially in the transition section of the phase 3 report. We have a number of tables and a number of examples of how the information can be used. So there are examples, for instance, in the funding and the transition sections of how you would use the funding approach. So we actually walk through step by step how you would take IFSD's funding approach and how you could generate your own estimate, whether you're an existing agency or whether you're a First Nation exercising jurisdiction. And when you're a First Nation exercising jurisdiction, we say, well, in IFSD's approach, you need a baseline. Here are 3 ways you might build or generate or access or develop a baseline. So we do those and we walk through those examples. So we think that from a funding perspective, it can be useful as a secondary data point to help put into context what we think would be relevant when we're thinking about the design and delivery of CFS. In the transition section of the report, there are a series of tables where we present the different components of transition. So I talked about strategy, processes, systems, people. We walk through those components for both existing FNCFS agencies as well as First Nations exercising jurisdiction. And we ask a series of questions and we offer a series of what we would call guiding questions or reflection questions to help those that are planning for these transitions, planning for these changes, and reflect on that content as well. So we did our best with the tools, Bryce. Sometimes our writing is a little boring, but also along with that, in the appendices of the phase 3 report, there are a few other places that you might want to look. Our collaborators, many of them, very generously shared their entire workbook or their entire profile as part of the report. So if there is a collaborator that you think looks like you or that you want to emulate, they shared things like their draft budgets. They shared things like their transition assessments. They shared their context profiles. They shared all sorts of tools that were developed as part of this project. And those are all appended. And I think it's, don't quote me, but I think it's Appendix N in the report, and you'll see all of them there. Along with that, there are other appendices where we have things like little lists of items or checklists that you might want to consider at the start of a transition process. So things like legal considerations, accounting considerations. So those lists are there as well. And then there's also an appendix that compiles program examples from prevention and protection that come from different service providers, agencies, and First Nations. So I hope that those tools are useful, Bryce, and hopefully you'll find some either agencies or First Nations that might share characteristics that you find exist in your community as well.
Thank you so much, Bryce, for all those questions. It definitely helps clarify, because I'm sure there's other people on the call who have those same burning questions. And for Dr. Gaspard, I want to thank you so much for making the information so accessible, for all of the work that you've done, not only in making a difference in the lives of Indigenous children, but also in bolstering the environment of care for families, really changing and supporting the holistic well-being of families, Indigenous families. So thank you for all your hard work from all of us here. Snei Chalye. So the last piece of information, we really wanted to just promote and share more information, and it's really on the resource package that has been developed by Our Children Our Way. And so I just want to, it's free for download. I do believe that Michelle's going to be sending it out as a link as well. Correct me if I'm wrong, Kai, that it's going to be going out. Feel free to share. Feel free to go on the website as well. And so I also want to make sure that information is as accessible as possible. All of us here at Our Children Our Way, if you have any questions, feel free to go through the website. We can also share our contact information, and Kai as well, and Kayla will be available too to point you in the right direction when it comes to jurisdiction information sharing. So don't hesitate to reach out. Perfect. So we will be notifying all the participants today when the resources will be available, and the recording and the webinar as well, because this is being recorded. I also want to draw your attention on Friday, May 9th from 10 to 12. We're going to have our next webinar. That's going to be on Jordan River and Anderson, entitled The Messenger. And so we are going to be observing the 20th anniversary of Jordan's Principle on May 10th. So I just want everybody to be aware of that. And really, it's really, we want to honor and acknowledge Jordan River Anderson, and for that, how much change has it really inspired Jordan's Principle, changing the lives of Indigenous children across Turtle Island. So want to acknowledge that. And on May 21st, join us for our last spring webinar, and that's entitled Journey to Jurisdiction, Critical Decision Points. So that's everything today. I don't think we have any other burning questions, but of course we wanted to also acknowledge what Regional Chief Teegee had mentioned. It's a really important day. It's a day to exercise our right to vote. As Indigenous people, we don't take this day for granted, and many of our ancestors did not have this opportunity. So we're just really encouraging you to spend the day to reflect and protect our most precious, that being our land and our children, and are also those not yet born. So please get out and vote. And thank you for your time. It was an honor spending time with you, and we look forward to spending more time with you. Oh, wait, thank Masai.
Thanks, Joni, Kai.
Thank
Talk
you
to you
so
again
much,
soon.
Helaina. Much appreciated.
So good to
Fabulous.
Good to
see
see
you.
you. Okay,
We'll see you
nice
soon.
to see you. Okay, so.